Hello and welcome to the CX Files for 1st of September 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal, Canada. Mark, great to be here. And I'm really excited about this week's interview because it's with a longtime friend of the CX Files, as well as a longtime friend of both yourself and myself, Victor Pereda from Nearsol.
Yeah, we've known Victor for a few years now, and he's always up to something interesting. You know, he's got links across the nearshore region, particularly Guatemala. But Nearsol's been doing some interesting stuff, and I asked Victor to come back because it was about maybe a year and a half ago. He was on the podcast talking about it was like development of BPO or development of contact centers and contact center design. He was talking about then, but I saw him talking on LinkedIn about a month ago, and it was about hypergrowth. And how do you handle hypergrowth when you build a startup and it suddenly explodes and everybody wants your product? How do you deal with the kind of customer support for that process? So I asked him to come on and talk about it a bit more, and he had a lot of views on that.
Well, you're right. Victor is always up to something interesting. And one of the things I love about Victor is the fact that he has taken his organization and diversified it into many different facets. And it was really, to me, quite interesting in the sense today that Victor talked a lot about this element about fast-moving organizations, and there's lots of them. Something that really struck me as interesting, Mark, and I don't want to give away the interview, but the fact that Victor alluded to many different organizations that are growing quickly that want to keep their focus on their core business, their core value proposition. Customer experience is something they're interested in. Customer experience is something they don't want to forsake, but they don't want to do it themselves. And this has left a huge opening open for service providers, whether it's on the technology side or on the traditional outsourcing side. So definitely a discussion that I think everybody warrants listening to, whether you're a buyer of services or a supplier of services.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We get the guests on here to talk about a theme or a subject. There's never any sort of indication that we're promoting anybody, and nobody pays to be on this podcast either. But I do think that Victor really had some strong points there because, if you launch a fintech and suddenly you start getting more customers than you can handle, you need some sort of structured way to actually grow that customer support process, while at the same time, your focus is actually going to be getting more customers. You want to focus on sales, revenue growth, perhaps the next round of investment, and getting a customer service partner on board that can really be agile and can grow as fast as your company is growing, just seems to make sense.
It does. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard stories about organizations that especially would fall into the digitally driven category that are rapidly expanding, and they've reached out proactively to members of the BPO community to say, hey, can you help us expand? Our most important facet is really our relationship with our end users. And Victor touched on that, being able to manage those relationships effectively so you're able to deliver not just a satisfactory response, but you're able to go above and beyond, counts for so much. And I truly think that as Victor talked about what the dynamic is going to be like for some of these fast-moving organizations, it really started to hit home because you can make or break a business by how you are servicing the end users. And if you're not coming up to scratch, if you're not meeting the expectations or exceeding them, a business really has nowhere to go but down.
Okay, great. So let's go straight to the interview with Victor Pereda, the CEO and founder of Nearsol. Okay, Victor, it's great to get you back again. You talked to the podcast just over a year ago, and that was on contact center design. So just as we kick off this conversation, let's maybe just have an update on what we talked about last year. So especially because we're hopefully seeing most of the pandemic in the rearview mirror now. So what's changing for BPO and contact center design in generally in this kind of post-pandemic environment?
Yeah, I think there's still, let's call it still stuck a bit in the sense that a lot of companies are okay with staying from a work from home environment, and some companies no, they realize it doesn't work for them. It worked in the short term, but not in the long term. So a lot of the things in the designs, right, where little things as putting special filters on the air con, so the air that it disperses is not contaminated per se, right? Everything that's circling, it gets a little treatment on it. Sliding doors, because every time that everywhere you put your hand to, right, and usually a doorknob is where you're going to be more exposed. So little things like that have changed in the design. Most companies are still operating at a lower percentage. They're if their clients still allow them to, let's say, stay 30% work from home, the 70% are dispersed between hours of operation and just sitting, because they're really trying to avoid still packing everybody in the same place, because all it takes is one person to get sick and maybe get the other 50 sick, and then now the companies are shorthanded, right? So they're still making those changes. A lot of companies do not want to make the investment, because if you really want to have it as close to let's call it pandemic free, you do have to invest the big bucks on a lot of changes into the design. But little things like that have been happening, and things that we have implemented for us and for our clients.
Okay, that's great. So, clearly we're still in a sort of transition period, I guess, but we'll see how it shakes out through probably more into next year then, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think this year is still like in limbo, right? They don't want to fully commit, but at the same time, they don't want to just not do anything about it. So I think it's still in limbo. I think, maybe next year, Q1, Q2, we'll start seeing more changes. But as of now, it's kind of, it's still what they call it. It's the new normal still going on.
Yeah. I think McKinsey called it the next normal, because they wanted to avoid saying that whatever we see right now is going to be the new normal. So I think they got it right, because there's always going to be a next normal after the current normal anyway.
That's very true. They hit it on the nail.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask you about agility in this conversation. So specifically around BPO agility. And, one of the recurring themes that I always see when I read the business magazines is startups. And especially once a startup becomes successful and they hit that kind of hypergrowth phase, more than 40% growth a year. And sometimes, you can see hundreds of percent growth a year when a company is really starting to become successful. And I'm always thinking, this must have a massive impact on how these companies can handle their customers, because it doesn't matter if it's like a fintech that suddenly takes off or a gaming company that takes off. Suddenly, if you're growing at 300% a year, then that means you're getting a lot of new customers, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it creates a big impact. A lot of these startups, they grow, let's call it overnight. And not only do they have to deal with, from investors to capacity of whatever product or service that they're distributing, where, let's call it customer experience or customer service is not really a priority. And sometimes they don't understand it. They're very knowledgeable in what they do for a living, but not on the actual support. And we actually do random calls to startups. We will call their contact center just to see what happens. And it's horrible, because they don't have that knowledge per se, right? They think we were able to create this on our own. Why do we need somebody else to help us with this? But at the end of the day, I think you really have to focus on whatever your strengths are, focus on that. And whatever is not, outsource it or figure out a way to be able to support it. Because, I think the customer experience or the return customer is essence for any type of company, any startup, right? And if you get a bad taste, and nowadays everything is, so open through social media, people can talk anything about anybody anywhere, and they can really hurt the reputation of a company that's really a company that wasn't expecting to have such a hyper growth, right? And if they don't do it correctly, they don't plan accordingly, they're gonna suffer, and it's gonna end up hitting them either from their valuation, their customer experience, customer retention, and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I imagine, though, that let's say I'm a startup founder, and I've just created this hot new fintech, for example. I would have thought that my main focus is growing the business, growing revenue, getting more sales, hiring people into the business, because we've got to keep hiring to keep growing. Surely the customer service can just kind of catch up with everything else. How would you say? I mean, I guess you would say that actually customer service should be a focus. But if I was in the position of a founder, then why should that be? Why should I be focusing on customer service just as much as growth?
I think you want customer loyalty, right? If a customer is treated the way they should, they get the support that they're expecting, they're gonna come back, right? And they'll buy your product or your service. And I mean, don't get me wrong, revenue, all that growth is super important, but you're not going to have it unless you have, client satisfaction. You might have the best product or service, but if you don't position it well, it's going to stall, right? So I think having everybody that's consuming your product, they need to be satisfied. They need to feel that you are important to them and not just a regular buyer. So to me, it's always been that I think it's, when somebody hangs up the phone or gets anything, resolved, either mail, chat, whatever it is, that they feel like they were taken care of, right? And a lot of these startups, they don't. They just see the massive growth and then they think, oh, we'll just catch up, like you're saying, and it doesn't. And then they'll be able to catch up once a big problem arises, and they figure out that they have to fix that. But if you can figure that out from the beginning, you're gonna avoid, let's call it loss of revenue, bad reputation, whatever it is that might be. But and again, I think your clientele is really the main force, right? Because if they don't come back for you, then your business just stalls, right?
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, that obviously you want to grow the business, but let's face it, if you're just annoying most of your customers, then eventually you're going to stall and they're not going to come back for more.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's consider the situation then, that I suppose most founders or most startups, they start with a captive customer service team. Quite often it's just internal. It's, half a dozen people in the office that are managing customer service. Why can I not just go out into the market, let's say on LinkedIn, hire a customer service director, give that person, him or her, here's a load of budget, go and hire some people, start building up our customer service operation? Why would that not be successful compared to actually just calling a company like yourselves and saying, hey guys, can you come and help us? Like what's the difference in me just trying to quickly scale up by hiring comparing to just sort of calling up a BPO like yourselves then?
The way I've always seen it is, it's not your core business, right? I think you need to focus on your core business because that's where you excel at. So something like, you can hire somebody to come and do the maintenance of your building, or you do it yourself, right? You don't do it yourself. You hire someone that's what they do for their core business, and you focus on increasing your revenue, right? So I think the same concept. I do feel that starting with a small captive typically makes sense, because that's where all the, let's call it all the learning curve will be, and they're going to be understanding, and that's where typically they realize this is not something that we can do. Again, I'm not saying that a captive cannot do it on their own. There's a lot of companies that are very capable and do a phenomenal job, but typically they've been either in the business for a longer time, or their executive team has been in different verticals and they understand a little bit better. But when it's a regular startup that they're so focused on whatever it is, whatever product it is, that's all they know. They don't know everything else that revolves around it. Right? So I do think it's important to hire a professional that understands not only, let's call it the type of business that you're in, but understands the market where you want the business to operate, where they understand the types of metrics that you should be looking at. Because that's something that happens to us when we talk to startups. They don't even know metrics. They don't even know how to measure, how to tell themselves if they're doing a phenomenal job or not. They don't. So there's some of the things that companies like ours help, right? We help them identify all the areas of improvement. How can we put in the right KPIs to ensure that the quality level is there, that the delivery level is there? So those are the little things that in some cases a captive will not understand. They will at some point through trials and tribulations, But if you can avoid that, right, outsource it, reduce your costs versus keeping it in house, keeping another headache inside, to me, it makes no sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned about the metrics there, because I was just thinking, like, in these kind of small, fast-growing companies, are the kind of metrics different to maybe large established companies? I mean, are you looking at measuring different things, or is there a sort of fundamental baseline that everybody's kind of interested in?
Yeah, there's a fundamental baseline, right? One, and two, there's some client-specific KPIs that you have to do. And again, let's call it a holding time for company A could be a minute, and for the other one has to be 10 seconds per se, right? So those are some of the little things that they might not be aware, right? And how do you increase the customer satisfaction? And that's kind of where we come in. And because they might say, okay, we want these KPIs, but do they even know what will be let's call it a good result? They don't. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of how quickly you can implement certain things. And right now also with technology, contact centers like ours, there's a lot of technology that can be implemented that could help improve the quality and even reduce costs to a lot of these captives, because those tools are already in place and they could fit almost every other company. And if they do it on their own, they're going to go back to trying to figure out how to get those tools, probably pay retail instead of wholesale. So there's a lot of variables that at the end of the day, I think affects it in general.
Okay, and if I go and Google hypergrowth, startup hypergrowth, these kind of topics, quite often I get directed to fintech brands, fintech companies. I mean, is this area really dominated by fintech, or are we seeing hypergrowth across many different types of vertical then?
Yeah, it's mostly fintech, because that's kind of like what's trending now as well, right? Just using that word, it's a trending word. But there are other startups that are not in that same vertical. But like I said, the ones that we hear about the most are in the fintech or some sort of technology base, right? Because that's where the world is kind of evolving, and the types of companies that are seeing the hyper growth and are requiring the support. But yeah, I agree with you. I think fintech is one of the most important ones, but I don't think it's the only one.
Okay. So just to sort of wrap up the conversation then, I just wanted to sort of reiterate what we were saying about hypergrowth being a dangerous time. I guess when you're looking at the various areas that you need to try and control, such as revenue, growth, sales, hiring, clearly the CX needs to be along that span of control. So if you were talking to a CEO, I mean, let's say a potential client calls you up and says, look, we only started up 4 months ago, but we're starting to see some traction. What do you advise we should be doing now?
I think we should probably start understanding the type of support that you'll be needing, right? Based on traction and any type of forecast that they have, right? It's not the same. Let's call it when Netflix first started, right? It was 2 guys out of a garage mailing the disc, right? And as soon as they grew and let's say they were able to see their ramp plan and their forecast, things had to change, right? They had to adapt to the changes. So I think something very similar, right? There's a lot of things that you can control now, but once you start seeing the growth or hyper growth, whatever you want to call it, you need to be prepared for it, right? And some of the things is really analyzing the type of support that you'll be needing and how much support will you be needing, and third, what type of support you want to be giving, right? There's some companies that they're okay with 80% client satisfaction. There's some companies that they're stricter, they want higher percentage. So it's really analyzing where does your product or service fit in that model from a satisfaction standpoint and support, and then from there kind of do a plan of how you're going to be able to scale it and how you're going to be able to adapt it because the market might be completely different in 3 months, or something new might come out that you might have to let's call it turn around and sell that product or service in a different way and be able to adapt to it. But to me, my first things will be, how do you foresee your company growing, what type of support you want to be able to give it, and the quality of the support that you want to do.
Yeah, and it sounds like the kind of environment where you're never going to build a 5-year plan, are you? It's like you're kind of always looking maybe 3 months out.
Correct, exactly. And I mean, they have visibility to a lot of these, right? Because let's call it on the private sector. They're, they're tied to a certain forecast, and they're able to, and I know they can't predict the future, but they're able to at least get a understanding of where they're going to be in the next 3 months and how you adapt to that, right? And how you evolve from that, because you might have, let's say 50x growth in 3 months, but you might have 200x in the next 3 months. And how do you adapt to that? How do you, because you don't want to go into this, let's say the 200x growth and then have horrible support service, and then the following quarter you're down to 25 because people don't want to come back, right? So those are the things that you do have to see what your growth plan is, and how do you adapt to ensure that your whatever quality and whatever support you want to do doesn't get affected too much, right? Because at some point it will get affected, because that's just part of life. There's a learning curve, but how do you try to maintain it as close as possible so your clientele doesn't walk away because of bad service?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. It was great to hear from you, Victor. I mean, I think that you've really talked about a kind of a chicken and an egg situation here, because, you really want your startup to grow fast. But if you don't also focus on delivering a great customer experience, then you just kind of hit a plateau and the customers won't come back. So yeah. I think stalling was what you said. And I think that sounds exactly right. Yeah. So great to hear from you. Thanks very much for that update. And maybe we'll get you back in a year then.
All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate the time, and looking forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.